Officer Derek Collins punches a black man during a road rage incident, only to discover later that Bradley is the newly appointed police commissioner. As the truth unravels and Derek faces the consequences of his actions, he embarks on a journey of redemption, confronting his biases and seeking to rebuild his shattered life. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Derek Collins drummed his fingers against the steering wheel of his patrol car, his jaw clenched tight as he watched another teenager speed past him on a skateboard. It was his third hour parked outside Lincoln High School, dealing with what he considered a complete waste of his time: noise complaints from cranky neighbors about kids being kids. The autumn sun beat down through his windshield as he took another sip of his now cold coffee. His phone buzzed again, another missed call from his mother. That made 5 this week. Derek jabbed the decline button with more force than necessary, shoving the phone back into his pocket. Should have been a detective by now, he muttered to himself, running a hand over his tired face. At 38, he had expected more from his career than babysitting suburban teenagers and responding to petty neighborhood disputes. The empty passenger seat beside him seemed to mock him, much like Rose's side of the bed had for the past 3 months since she'd walked out. "I don't even recognize you anymore," she'd said. Those words still stung, even if he pretended they didn't. A call crackled through his radio, interrupting his brooding. Another noise complaint, this time about a dog barking 2 blocks away. Derek felt his blood pressure rise as he started the car. "Dispatch, this is Collins, I'm responding," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made the dispatcher hesitate before acknowledging. As he pulled away from the curb, memories of his mother's last voicemail played in his mind. "Derek, honey, please call me back. We need to talk about Dad's anniversary coming up." He'd deleted it halfway through. The day dragged on with more minor incidents: a dispute over a property line, a stolen bicycle, a complaint about music being too loud at the local coffee shop. Each call chipped away at what little patience he had left. Just as his shift was about to end, the radio crackled to life again. "All units in the vicinity of Madison and Oak, we have reports of a road rage incident. 2 vehicles involved. Possible confrontation in progress." Derek reached for the radio, grateful for something that might actually require real police work. "Unit 247 responding. I'm 3 minutes out." His siren wailed to life as he made a sharp U-turn, leaving behind the quiet suburban streets that had been slowly suffocating him all day. Derek pulled up to the intersection of Madison and Oak, his patrol car's lights flashing against the storefront windows. 2 cars blocked the right lane, a shiny black Mercedes and a beat-up Toyota sedan with peeling paint. The drivers stood face-to-face on the sidewalk, their voices carrying over the evening traffic. The Mercedes driver, a man in an expensive suit, pointed his finger and shouted, "You cut me off! You could have caused an accident." The other driver, a black man in work clothes, held his hands up defensively. "I signaled. You were the one speeding up when I tried to merge." Derek's eyes narrowed as he stepped out of his patrol car. He'd seen this scenario play out before, someone in a fancy car getting harassed by a reckless driver. Without hesitation, he approached the Mercedes owner first. "Evening, sir. Are you all right?" Derek asked, his tone sympathetic and professional. The man in the suit straightened his tie. "This person cut me off and nearly hit my car. I had to swerve to avoid him." Derek nodded, then turned to the black driver with a hard stare. "Let me see your license and registration. Now." His voice carried a sharp edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Officer, I was just trying to—" the man started to explain. "I said now!" Derek barked, taking an aggressive step forward. "And keep your hands where I can see them." The black driver slowly reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate and careful. "I signaled properly, officer. I have a dash cam that—" "Did I ask you to speak?" Derek cut him off, his voice rising. "Because I don't remember asking for excuses. What I want to know is why you thought it was okay to endanger other drivers with your reckless behavior." The Mercedes owner stood back, arms crossed, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth as Derek continued his harsh questioning. "How long have you had this vehicle?" Derek demanded, circling the old Toyota. When was your last inspection? Those tires look worn to me. Each question came faster than the last, not giving the man time to respond. The black driver's shoulders tensed as Derek fired off more accusations, his hands still raised slightly at his sides. The evening traffic crawled past, drivers slowing down to watch the scene unfold on the sidewalk. Through the window of the Daily Grind coffee shop, Bradley Fisher watched the scene unfold with growing concern. His untouched cappuccino sat cooling on the table as he observed the officer's aggressive stance and heard his raised voice through the glass. Bradley's hands tightened around his briefcase handle. After 30 years of working in community relations and law enforcement oversight, he knew exactly what he was witnessing. The familiar knot formed in his stomach, the same one he'd felt countless times before when confronting systemic injustice. "Lord, give me strength," he whispered, watching the black driver's dignified attempts to explain himself while being repeatedly cut off by the hostile officer. Bradley shifted in his seat, his conscience weighing heavy. As the newly appointed police commissioner, he had the authority to intervene. But years of experience had taught him that timing was everything in these situations. One wrong move could escalate things and make life even harder for the driver. The officer's voice grew louder, echoing off the storefront windows. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before driving in this neighborhood." Bradley's jaw clenched. He'd spent his career building bridges between law enforcement and the community, working tirelessly to change attitudes like this from within the system. Now, watching this unfold right in front of him, staying silent felt like betraying everything he stood for. He thought of his own son who'd faced similar treatment. He thought of all the meetings he'd sat through, all the promises of reform, all the sensitivity training sessions that seemed to change nothing. "Sometimes," his grandmother used to say, "doing nothing is the same as doing wrong." Bradley stood up slowly, straightening his shirt. His heart pounded, but his movements were deliberate and calm. He'd learned long ago that in moments like these, composure was as important as courage. Taking a deep breath, he gathered his belongings and headed toward the coffee shop's door. The weight of his position, his responsibility, and his experience all pushed him forward. Someone needed to stand up, and God had put him in the right place at the right time to do just that. Bradley stepped out of the coffee shop, his polished shoes clicking against the sidewalk as he approached the heated scene. The afternoon sun caught his police commissioner's badge, though he didn't draw attention to it yet. "Excuse me, officer," Bradley said in a measured tone. "Perhaps we could approach this situation differently?" Derek's head snapped around, his face flushing red at the interruption. "Sir, this is a police matter. Please step back." "I understand," Bradley replied softly, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. "I just noticed there are several security cameras in the area. Maybe we could review the footage to get a clearer picture of what happened." "Mind your own business," Derek barked, taking an aggressive step toward Bradley. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his belt. "I don't need anyone telling me how to do my job." A small crowd had begun to gather on both sides of the street. Bradley noticed people pulling out their phones, recording the interaction. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Officer," Bradley tried again, maintaining his calm demeanor, "I'm simply suggesting we gather all the available evidence. Back up now." Derek's face had turned a deeper shade of red, his jaw clenched tight. His whole body seemed to vibrate with barely contained rage. "This is your final warning," the growing audience murmured nervously. Some people shook their heads in disapproval at Derek's behavior, while others whispered among themselves. The two original drivers stood frozen, watching the scene unfold between Bradley and Derek. Bradley remained steady, his hands still visible, his voice unwavering. "Officer Collins," he said, having glimpsed the name tag, taking a moment to breathe and— "I said back up," Derek shouted, his voice cracking with anger. His hands were shaking now, his eyes wild with a combination of fury and fear. The crowd gasped at his outburst, and more phones came up to record the confrontation. In a split second of blind rage, Derek's fist shot out, connecting with Bradley's jaw. The sound of the impact echoed through the stunned silence that followed. Bradley stumbled backward, losing his balance, and fell onto the hard pavement. The crowd erupted in shocked gasps and cries. "Oh my God!" someone shouted. The air filled with the sounds of phone cameras clicking and people dialing 911. The two drivers from the original incident stepped back, their argument forgotten in the face of this shocking turn of events. Bradley touched his jaw gently, wincing at the tenderness, but his eyes remained steady and focused. He made no move to get up quickly, instead taking deliberate breaths to stay composed. A trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth, but his dignity remained intact. Derek stood frozen, his fist still clenched as the reality of what he'd just done crashed over him. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. The rage that had consumed him moments ago began to dissolve into something else: fear, shame, panic. "Officer Collins," Bradley said quietly, his voice steady despite his split lip. "Those security cameras I mentioned, they just recorded everything that happened here." He gestured to the multiple CCTV cameras mounted on the surrounding buildings. "Why don't we all take a deep breath and review the footage? It will show us the truth about both incidents." Derek's eyes darted around, taking in the dozens of phones pointed at him, the disapproving faces, the whispers. His shoulders slumped as the fight drained out of him. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical force. "Fine," Derek muttered through clenched teeth, his face burning with humiliation. "We'll check the cameras." He stepped back, creating space between himself and Bradley, who was now slowly rising to his feet. Several bystanders moved to help Bradley up, but he raised his hand politely, declining their assistance. He stood on his own, straightened his tie, and maintained his dignified bearing despite the angry red mark forming on his face. Inside the dimly lit convenience store office, Derek stood with his arms crossed, watching the grainy security footage play out on a small monitor. The shop owner, a middle-aged man with reading glasses perched on his nose, had rewound the tape several times to show the crucial moments. The footage was crystal clear. The white man's luxury car had come speeding around the corner, cutting off the older sedan. The black driver had barely managed to brake in time to avoid a collision. When both drivers got out of their cars, it was the luxury car owner who had approached aggressively, jabbing his finger and getting in the other man's face. Derek's stomach churned as he watched. Each second of footage stripped away his earlier certainty, replacing it with a gnawing shame that made his collar feel too tight. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, hyper-aware of the eyes watching him. Behind him, Bradley stood quietly, his presence a silent reminder of Derek's multiple mistakes. The bruise on Bradley's face was darkening, making Derek's shame even more acute. "Well," Derek said gruffly, trying to maintain some semblance of authority, "guess we know who's at fault here." He turned and strode out of the office, his footsteps heavy against the linoleum floor. Back outside, Derek approached the luxury car driver, who was still wearing a smug expression. "Sir, I'm going to need your license and registration," he said, his voice clipped and professional. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote out the ticket, documenting the reckless driving and aggressive behavior. The luxury car owner's face reddened as he received the ticket. "But I thought, you seemed to understand earlier," he sputtered, looking betrayed. "The footage doesn't lie, sir," Derek replied flatly, avoiding eye contact. He could feel Bradley's steady gaze on his back as he completed the paperwork, each moment stretching uncomfortably long. The weight of his prejudice, so obvious now in the harsh light of evidence, pressed down on Derek's shoulders. He had been so quick to judge, so certain in his assumptions, and so completely wrong. And then he had made it worse, so much worse, with his violence against an innocent man who had only tried to help. Bradley turned away from the scene without a word, his measured steps carrying him down the sidewalk until he disappeared around the corner. The crowd that had gathered began to drift away too, their whispers and disapproving glances making Derek's skin prickle with discomfort. Left alone with his thoughts, Derek slammed his car door shut harder than necessary. The sound echoed through the nearly empty street, matching the thundering of his pulse in his ears. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, trying to steady his trembling hands. "Get it together," he muttered to himself, adjusting his rearview mirror. The face that stared back at him looked strained and unfamiliar. There was a smudge of dirt on his uniform from the scuffle, a visible reminder of his loss of control. During the drive back to the station, every red light felt like an eternity. Each stop forced him to sit with his thoughts, replaying the incident over and over. The way he'd immediately sided with the luxury car driver. The sound his fist had made when it connected with Bradley's face. The damning security footage that had exposed his prejudice for all to see. The familiar sight of the police station usually brought Derek a sense of pride, but today it just made his stomach twist. He parked in his usual spot and took several deep breaths before heading inside. Officer Martinez looked up from his desk as Derek walked past. "Hey Collins, how'd that road rage call go?" "Fine," Derek said shortly, not breaking his stride. "Just another routine call." The lie felt bitter on his tongue, but it was easier than admitting the truth. He could feel Martinez's curious gaze following him as he made his way to his desk. But thankfully, his colleague didn't press for details. Derek dropped heavily into his chair, pretending to busy himself with paperwork. But the words on the forms in front of him blurred together as his mind kept drifting back to the incident, to Bradley's calm demeanor, to the crowd's shocked faces, to his own inexcusable behavior. Derek's apartment felt emptier than usual that evening. The familiar comfort of his worn leather couch offered no solace as he kicked off his shoes and loosened his tie. Even his usual routine of microwaving leftover pizza couldn't distract him from the gnawing feeling in his gut. He sank into the couch, the events of the day playing on an endless loop in his mind. The prejudiced assumptions, the anger, the punch. His face burned with shame every time he remembered Bradley falling to the ground, maintaining that infuriating composure even then. "Just stop thinking about it," he muttered to himself, grabbing the remote and flicking on the TV. He started channel surfing, barely registering the blur of images and sounds. Game show, weather report, commercial, sports highlights. Then something made him freeze. His finger hovered over the remote's button as a familiar face appeared on the screen. The news anchor's voice filled the quiet room. In a groundbreaking appointment, Bradley Fisher has been named the city's new police commissioner. Fisher, known for his work in community relations, promises sweeping changes to improve trust between law enforcement and... Derek's mouth went dry. The remote slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. There on his TV screen was Bradley Fisher, the same man he had punched just hours ago, standing at a podium in a pristine suit. The same calm, dignified expression. The same steady gaze. "No," Derek whispered, his voice cracking. "No, no, no." The news segment continued, showing Bradley shaking hands with city officials, but Derek could barely breathe. The man he had assaulted, the man he had dismissed and disrespected, wasn't just any concerned citizen. He was his new boss. Cold sweat broke out on Derek's forehead as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. His hands started trembling again. And this time, he couldn't make them stop. The next morning, the station's main conference room was packed with officers in their crisp blue uniforms. Derek slipped in through the back door, trying to make himself as small as possible among his colleagues. His palms were sweaty and his collar felt too tight. Chief Martinez stood at the podium, his voice echoing through the room. "It gives me great pleasure to introduce our new commissioner, Bradley Fisher." Derek's stomach lurched as Bradley walked to the front of the room. The bruise on Bradley's jaw from yesterday's punch was barely visible, covered by skilled makeup, but Derek couldn't stop staring at it. Bradley adjusted the microphone, his presence commanding immediate respect. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice warm and steady. "I believe in the power of community. I believe in the strength that comes from understanding one another, from listening before judging." The words hit Derek like physical blows. He shifted uncomfortably, grateful for the crowd that helped hide him. "Our badges represent a sacred trust," Bradley continued. "Every interaction we have with the public is an opportunity to build bridges or burn them. The choice is ours." Derek's chest tightened. He thought about yesterday's incident, about how quickly he had burned that bridge, about how wrong he had been. "Justice isn't just about enforcing laws," Bradley's voice carried through the room. "It's about treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their background." As Bradley spoke these words, his eyes swept across the room in a slow arc. Derek tried to look down, but it was too late. Their eyes met for a brief moment that felt like an eternity. Derek's heart hammered against his ribs, and he felt a bead of sweat roll down his back. Bradley's gaze moved on, continuing his scan of the room, but Derek felt exposed, as if everyone could see his guilt written across his face. The rest of Bradley's words became a distant blur as blood rushed in Derek's ears. He wanted nothing more than to disappear, to escape the suffocating weight of his shame. Derek sat on the wooden bench in the locker room, his head in his hands. The meeting had ended 15 minutes ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave this safe haven. The familiar smell of metal and old leather usually brought him comfort, but today it felt suffocating. "Collins!" Officer Martinez's voice echoed through the locker room. "Captain wants to see you. Now." Derek's heart sank. He knew this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Standing up slowly, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. His face was pale, his usual confident stance replaced by slumped shoulders. The walk to the captain's office felt like the longest of his life. Each step on the worn linoleum floor echoed in his ears. Other officers passed by, but their faces were just blurs. His mind raced with possible scenarios, none of them good. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Photos of past police chiefs lined the walls, their stern faces watching his slow march toward judgment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making him feel like he was walking through a tunnel. Derek's mouth went dry as he approached the captain's door. The frosted glass window showed shadows moving inside, more than one person. His stomach churned at the thought of facing Bradley again, of having to look into the eyes of the man he'd wronged so terribly. He paused outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Through the glass, he could make out the outline of two figures. One was definitely the captain, and the other? Derek's throat tightened. The other had to be Commissioner Fisher. His fingers trembled as they reached for the doorknob. The metal felt ice cold against his sweaty palm. For a moment, he considered turning around and walking away, maybe even turning in his badge. It would be easier than facing what waited on the other side of that door, but he knew he couldn't run. Not this time. Derek turned the doorknob and stepped into the captain's office. The room felt smaller than usual, cramped with the weight of what was about to happen. Captain Reynolds sat behind his desk, his weathered face unreadable. To his right, Commissioner Fisher sat perfectly composed in one of the visitor chairs, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "Officer Collins," the captain said, "please take a seat." Derek lowered himself into the empty chair, trying not to look directly at Bradley. The leather creaked beneath him, impossibly loud in the quiet room. "We need to discuss yesterday's incident," Captain Reynolds continued. "Commissioner Fisher has brought some concerns to my attention. I'd like you to walk us through what happened, and then you'll need to file a formal report." Derek's throat felt like sandpaper. He cleared it awkwardly and shifted in his chair. "Yes, sir. I received a call about a road rage incident." He paused, his eyes fixed on the captain's desk calendar. "When I arrived on scene, there were two drivers involved in an altercation." The words came out mechanical, rehearsed. Derek could feel Bradley's steady gaze on him, but he couldn't bring himself to meet it. "And then," the captain prompted, I made some assumptions." Derek's voice cracked slightly. "I didn't handle the situation properly. He struggled to find the right words, his usual confidence completely gone. "I showed bias in how I approached the drivers." The silence in the room was suffocating. Bradley hadn't said a word, but his presence filled every corner of the office. Derek's hands were trembling slightly, and he clasped them together to hide it. "I acted unprofessionally," Derek continued, his words coming out in a rush. "I thought I was reading the situation correctly, but I wasn't. I was wrong. And then when Commissioner Fisher tried to help, His voice trailed off, the memory of throwing that punch making his stomach turn. He risked a glance at Bradley, whose face remained impassive, professional. Those calm eyes seemed to see right through Derek's attempts at justification, making his explanations feel hollow and inadequate. "The thing is," Derek stumbled over his words, "I was having a rough day and I just... No, that's not..." He shook his head, realizing how pathetic his excuses sounded. The truth was, there was no justification for what he'd done, and they all knew it. "And that's what happened yesterday," Derek finished, his voice barely above a whisper. Bradley shifted slightly in his chair, reaching down to pick up his briefcase. The soft click of the latches made Derek's heart skip a beat. With deliberate movements, Bradley withdrew a worn manila folder and placed it gently on the captain's desk. "There's something else we need to discuss, Officer Collins," Bradley said, his voice steady and measured. "Last year, there was an incident at Franklin Park. A young black teenager was detained without cause during a routine patrol." Captain Reynolds's face paled. He looked down at the folder, then quickly away, as if the sight of it burned his eyes. "The complaint was filed but never properly investigated," Bradley continued, opening the folder. "The teenager's mother provided witness statements and cell phone footage, but somehow the case was overlooked." Derek's collar felt too tight. The room seemed to shrink around him as Bradley carefully laid out several documents on the desk. He recognized the incident immediately, the memory he'd tried so hard to bury coming back in vivid detail. "The footage shows you using excessive force on a 14-year-old boy who was simply playing basketball with his friends," Bradley said, his calm voice making the words even more devastating. "When his mother tried to intervene, you threatened to arrest her for obstruction." Derek's hands went numb. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead as Bradley methodically presented more evidence, witness statements, photographs, the official complaint that had mysteriously disappeared from the system. "This isn't an isolated incident, Officer Collins," Bradley said, his eyes fixed on Derek. "It's a pattern." The captain shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unable to meet either man's gaze. The weight of his own complicity in burying the complaint seemed to press down on his shoulders. Derek struggled to breathe. The faces of both the teenage boy and his mother flashed through his mind. He remembered his own righteous anger that day, the absolute certainty he'd felt in his actions. But now, sitting here with the evidence laid bare, that certainty crumbled to dust. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet office. "Officer Collins, given the severity of these incidents, I have no choice but to place you on administrative leave pending a full investigation." Derek's stomach dropped. The words hit him like a physical blow, and he could feel the blood rushing to his face. "Your badge and gun, please," the captain said, extending his hand across the desk. Derek's fingers trembled as he reached for his badge. The metal felt cold against his palm, and for a moment he couldn't let go. This badge had been his identity, his shield against the world. Slowly, mechanically, he placed it on the captain's desk. The soft clink it made seemed to echo through the room. Next came his service weapon. The holster felt impossibly heavy as he unclipped it. Each movement was like moving through molasses, his body fighting against what his mind knew he had to do. Bradley sat quietly, his presence a silent witness to Derek's humiliation. Derek couldn't bring himself to look at him, couldn't bear to see the composed expression he knew would be there. "The Internal Affairs Office will contact you within 48 hours, Captain Reynolds said, his voice softer now, tinged with disappointment. "Until then, you're to remain at home." Derek pushed himself up from his chair. The room spun slightly, and he had to steady himself against the desk. Without a word, without even a glance at Bradley, he turned and yanked the door open. The walk through the station felt endless. Every eye seemed to follow him. Every whispered conversation seemed about him. His footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor, each step taking him further from everything he'd worked for. Outside, the bright sunlight felt like an insult. Derek stumbled to his car, fumbling with his keys. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside, he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The fury came then, hot and sharp, burning away the numbness. But underneath it was something worse. The crushing weight of knowing he had no one to blame but himself. His reputation, the respect he'd earned over years of service, all of it potentially destroyed because he couldn't control his prejudices. He started the car, the engine roaring to life. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he caught a glimpse of himself in the rearview mirror. The face that stared back looked lost, defeated, and utterly alone. Derek slammed his front door shut, the sound echoing through his empty apartment. The silence that followed was deafening. Without his badge, without his gun, he felt naked, exposed. His hands were still shaking as he made his way to the kitchen. The bottle of whiskey sat on top of his fridge untouched for months. He'd promised himself he wouldn't drink alone anymore, not after what happened with Rose. But today was different. Today, everything had fallen apart. The first drink burned going down. The second was easier. By the third, he'd stopped counting. Derek slumped onto his worn leather couch, the glass dangling from his fingers. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his living room floor, and he watched them crawl across the carpet, his mind replaying every mistake, every assumption, every wrong decision that had led him here. Bradley's face kept appearing in his thoughts, calm, composed, righteous. The old case file Bradley had produced felt like a knife in his gut. He hadn't just messed up once, he'd made a pattern of it. The realization made him pour another drink. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. His mother's name flashed across the screen. Derek let it ring. What would he even say to her? That her son was exactly the kind of cop she'd always warned him not to become. The whiskey bottle was half empty now. Derek's head swam, but the shame wouldn't fade. 20 years on the force. And what did he have to show for it? A collection of complaints, a suspended badge, and a reputation he'd probably never recover. He stumbled to the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink as he stared at his reflection. The man looking back at him was a stranger, red-faced, bleary-eyed, defeated. This wasn't who he'd wanted to be when he'd first put on the uniform. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost himself. The room spun slightly as he made his way back to the couch. The whiskey bottle beckoned, promising temporary relief from the thoughts that wouldn't stop churning in his head. Derek reached for it again, knowing it wouldn't help, but unable to stop himself. It was easier than facing the truth about who he'd become. Derek slouched deeper into his couch, the empty whiskey bottle rolling at his feet. Bradley's face kept appearing in his mind, that frustratingly steady expression, even after being struck. No anger, no hatred, just patience. "Why didn't you fight back?" Derek muttered to himself, running his hands through his disheveled hair. The question had been gnawing at him all day. He remembered Bradley's words at the station, measured and precise, laying out the evidence of Derek's past misconduct. There had been no satisfaction in Bradley's voice, no desire for revenge, just facts, presented with an almost gentle firmness. Derek's anger flared again, but it felt different now, hollow like a mask slipping. He thought about how Bradley had suggested checking the CCTV footage, giving Derek a chance to see the truth for himself rather than simply calling him out. Even after being punched, Bradley had remained focused on finding the truth, not on getting even. The realization hit Derek like a physical blow. Bradley hadn't been trying to destroy him. He'd been trying to make him see. See what? Derek wondered, his alcohol-fuzzy mind struggling with the question. See his own prejudices? The way he'd immediately sided with the white driver? The assumptions he'd made without evidence? "When did I become this person?" Derek whispered into the darkness. He thought back to his early days on the force, full of ideals about protecting and serving everyone equally. Somewhere along the way, those ideals had twisted into something ugly. He'd started seeing threats where there were none, making snap judgments based on nothing but his own biases. The memory of Bradley's calm dignity made Derek's own behavior seem even more shameful by comparison. He hadn't just failed as a police officer, he'd failed as a human being. The thought brought tears to his eyes, surprising him with their suddenness. Derek stood at his mother's front door, his hand frozen inches from the knocker. The small house looked exactly as he remembered it. The chipped blue paint, the crooked mailbox, the garden gnome with its faded red hat. His heart hammered in his chest as memories of their last argument flooded back. Finally, he knocked. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet neighborhood. Through the door's window, he saw movement. Then his mother appeared, her gray hair shorter than he remembered. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Derek?" She opened the door slowly, as if afraid he might disappear. "What are you—" "Hi, Mom." His voice cracked. He shifted his weight, feeling like an awkward teenager again. I was in the neighborhood." They both knew it was a lie. She lived 40 minutes away. "Would you like to come in?" she asked softly, stepping aside. Derek nodded and followed her into the familiar living room. Everything smelled the same, like lavender and fresh laundry. His mother's collection of ceramic angels still lined the windowsill, catching the afternoon light. "Can I get you some coffee?" she asked, wringing her hands. "Sure." He sat stiffly on the edge of the couch. "Mom, The words stuck in his throat. How could he explain everything? The suspension, Bradley, the shame that had finally cracked his defensive shell. His mother returned with 2 mugs, setting them on the coffee table. She sat in her old rocking chair, waiting. "I'm sorry," he finally managed, "for staying away, for the things I said." He stared into his coffee cup, unable to meet her eyes. I haven't been the person you raised me to be." "Oh, Derek." His mother's voice was gentle, lacking the judgment he'd feared. "What happened?" Looking at her concerned face, Derek felt something break inside him. The walls he'd built, the anger he'd nursed for so long, it all seemed so pointless now. He'd pushed away the one person who had always believed in him, just like he'd pushed away everyone else who tried to help. "I messed up, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Really messed up, and I don't know how to fix it." Next day, in the quiet of his apartment, Derek sat surrounded by printouts and open browser tabs on his laptop. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago as he immersed himself in article after article about police brutality and systemic racism. His eyes burned from reading, but he couldn't stop. Each new piece of information hit him like a punch to the gut. Stories of innocent lives lost, families torn apart, and communities living in fear of the very people sworn to protect them. He thought about all the times he dismissed these concerns, brushed them off as playing the race card, or making everything about color. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered, running his hands through his unkempt hair. He came across a video of a black mother teaching her young son how to behave if stopped by police. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Derek's throat tightened as he watched the fear in the child's eyes, the resigned sadness in the mother's voice as she explained what to do to stay alive. His mind wandered to all the traffic stops he'd conducted over the years. How many times had he approached a car with his hand already on his weapon just because of the driver's skin color? How many people had he treated with suspicion for no reason other than his own prejudice? Derek opened his notebook and began writing down specific incidents he could remember. Each entry made him feel sick to his stomach. There was the time he'd aggressively questioned that young black college student about a stolen car, only to discover the car belonged to him, or when he'd automatically assumed that Hispanic teenager was in a gang just because of his neighborhood. The list grew longer. With each memory, Derek forced himself to confront the pain and fear he must have caused. These weren't just incidents. They were real people whose lives he had impacted with his biased actions. "This isn't enough," he whispered to himself, closing the notebook. Reading articles and feeling guilty wouldn't change anything. He needed to do more, to be better. But the shame of his past actions felt overwhelming. How could he possibly make amends for years of causing harm? After days of internal debate, Derek finally stood on James Walker's front porch, his heart pounding against his ribs. He'd gotten the address from the incident report, and now here he was, about to face one of the people he'd wronged. The modest house had cheerful yellow flowers in window boxes and a welcome mat that read, "Bless this home." Derek's palms were sweaty as he pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed inside, followed by approaching footsteps. When the door opened, James Walker's expression shifted from neutral to shocked, then guarded. He stood tensely in the doorway, wearing casual weekend clothes, a stark contrast to the business attire he'd worn during their first encounter. "Officer Collins?" James said, his voice careful and measured. "Mr. Walker, Derek's rehearsed speech disappeared from his mind. He swallowed hard. "I came to apologize. The way I treated you that day was completely wrong. I made assumptions about you before I even knew what happened, and I acted unprofessionally and racist." The last word felt like glass in his throat, but he forced himself to say it. James remained silent, studying Derek's face. I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything, Derek continued, his voice shaking slightly. But I wanted you to know that I recognize how wrong I was, and I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. James took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. I appreciate you coming here to say this, he said finally. It couldn't have been easy. No, sir, it wasn't, Derek admitted, but it was necessary. James nodded slowly. Well, thank you for the apology. I accept it. His tone was genuine, but still held a hint of caution. Derek felt a small weight lift from his shoulders, though he knew this was just one small step on a much longer journey. The relief was tempered by the understanding that one apology couldn't erase years of harmful behavior. That afternoon, Derek's footsteps echoed through the empty hallway of the police headquarters as he made his way to Bradley Fisher's office. His heart hammered in his chest, and his uniform felt tight around his neck, even though he wasn't wearing one during his suspension. The nameplate on the door read Commissioner Bradley Fisher in bold letters. Derek stared at it for a long moment, his hand frozen mid-air, ready to knock. Through the frosted glass, he could see Bradley's silhouette at his desk. Taking a deep breath, Derek knocked softly. Come in, Bradley's steady voice called out. Derek opened the door slowly, finding Bradley looking up from a stack of papers. Surprise flickered across the commissioner's face, but it quickly settled into his usual calm expression. Officer Collins? Bradley said, setting down his pen. I wasn't expecting you. I know, sir, I'm sorry to come unannounced. Derek's voice cracked slightly. He stood awkwardly by the door, his hands trembling at his sides. Bradley gestured to the chair across from his desk. Please, sit down. As Derek settled into the chair, tears began welling up in his eyes. He blinked hard, trying to hold them back, but they spilled over anyway. Commissioner Fisher, he started, his voice thick with emotion. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I needed to tell you how sorry I am. Not just for hitting you, but for everything. My attitude, my prejudices, all of it. Bradley leaned forward, his expression softening as he watched Derek struggle with his emotions. I don't know how to fix this, Derek continued, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I don't know how to make things right, but I want to try. I need to try. Would you help me understand where to start? Bradley sat quietly, his hands folded on the desk as he listened to Derek's emotional confession. The afternoon sun filtered through the office blinds, casting long shadows across the room. I've been so angry for so long, Derek continued, his voice shaky. I pushed everyone away. My mother, my friends, anyone who tried to get close. And I took that anger out on the people I was supposed to protect. Bradley nodded slowly, his eyes showing a depth of understanding that made Derek's shoulders slump with relief. When Bradley finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Redemption isn't like flipping a switch, Officer Collins, he said, leaning back in his chair. It's not something you can earn with a single apology or one good deed. It's a journey, often a long and difficult one. Derek wiped his eyes with his sleeve, hanging on to every word. You're looking for a clear path forward, Bradley continued. But I can't give you that. What I can tell you is this: start with yourself. The way we treat others is often a reflection of how we treat ourselves. Bradley stood up and walked to the window, his reflection thoughtful in the glass. You mentioned your mother. That relationship, that's where your healing could begin. Reconnect with the people who knew you before the anger took over. Remember who you were, who you could be. He turned back to face Derek. Your humanity, Officer Collins. That's what needs healing first. The rest will follow, but it takes time, patience, and constant self-reflection. There are no shortcuts in this process. Derek nodded, understanding dawning in his tear-stained face. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope breaking through his shame. Derek pulled up to his mother's modest house, carrying a bag of groceries he'd picked up on the way. It had been 3 weeks since his conversation with Bradley, and he'd made it a point to visit his mother every few days. The front yard, once overgrown, was now neatly trimmed, the result of his weekend work. "Mom?" he called out as he let himself in with the spare key she'd given him last week. The house smelled of coffee and fresh laundry. "In the kitchen, Derek," she replied, her voice carrying a warmth that had been absent for years. He found her sorting through old photos at the kitchen table. Setting down the groceries, he noticed her hands trembling slightly as she tried to open a stubborn jar of pickle relish. "Here, let me help with that," he said, taking the jar from her. As he worked on the lid, his mother studied his face. "You look better," she said softly. "Less angry." Derek paused, the jar forgotten in his hands. "I'm trying, Mom. I really am." They worked together, preparing lunch, moving around each other in the small kitchen. Derek chopped vegetables while his mother told stories about his childhood, stories he'd forgotten or pushed away. The simple act of making sandwiches together became a bridge across years of distance. Over lunch, Derek opened up about his suspension, his voice thick with emotion. "I became someone I didn't want to be," he admitted, staring into his coffee cup. "I let my anger control everything." His mother reached across the table and placed her hand over his, the first time she'd initiated physical contact since he'd started visiting again. "We all lose our way sometimes, Derek. What matters is that you're finding your way back." The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window as they continued talking. Derek helped her with the dishes, fixed a loose cabinet door, and listened as she shared her own regrets about their estrangement. There were still awkward pauses and careful words, but beneath it all was a growing sense of healing. Before leaving, Derek noticed his mother's eyes getting misty as she hugged him goodbye. "Same time next week?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "How about sooner?" Derek replied. "I could come by on Wednesday, help you clean out that garage like you mentioned." His mother's smile was answer enough. One crisp afternoon, Derek sat in the therapist's waiting room, his leg bouncing nervously. The gentle hum of a white noise machine couldn't mask the pounding of his heart. This was his 4th session with Dr. Chen, and though the first 3 had been difficult, he kept coming back. "Officer Collins?" the receptionist called. "Just Derek," he corrected quietly, standing up. He wasn't sure when he'd be an officer again, or if he even wanted to be. Inside Dr. Chen's office, Derek settled into the now familiar leather chair. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, creating a soft, safe atmosphere that still felt foreign to him. "How was your week, Derek?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice gentle but professional. Derek took a deep breath. "I caught myself getting angry at the grocery store," he admitted. "Someone cut me off with their cart. Before I would have, well, but I tried that breathing technique you taught me." "And how did that feel?" "Strange at first, but then lighter somehow." Derek rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit he was becoming more aware of. "It's like I'm meeting myself for the first time, seeing all these patterns I never noticed before." They discussed his progress with his mother, his ongoing struggles with shame about the incident with Bradley, and the anger that had shaped so much of his life. Dr. Chen helped him trace the roots of his defensive behavior back to his childhood, making connections he'd never seen before. "I always thought being tough meant pushing everything down," Derek said, his voice cracking slightly. "But it's actually harder to face it all, isn't it?" Dr. Chen smiled warmly. "That's an important insight, Derek. Real strength often looks different than we expect." As they worked through some new coping strategies, Derek felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the false bravado he'd hidden behind for so long, but genuine hope that he could change, that he could become someone better. "Your homework this week," Dr. Chen said near the end of their session, "is to keep journaling about your anger triggers, but I'd also like you to write down moments when you choose a different response. Can you do that?" Derek nodded, already mentally noting how different this felt from the old him who would have scoffed at the idea of keeping a journal. "I can do that," he said, and for the first time, he truly believed it. As days goes by, one morning, Derek stood in the back of the community center's kitchen, quietly washing dishes, while others served food at the weekly soup kitchen. Steam rose from the sink as he scrubbed each pot and pan, finding an unexpected peace in the simple task. He'd been volunteering here for 3 weeks now, always choosing the behind-the-scenes work that kept him away from the spotlight. "Need help with those?" Maria, one of the regular volunteers, asked as she dropped off another stack of plates. "I've got it," Derek replied softly, offering a small smile. Nobody here knew he was a suspended police officer, and he preferred it that way. To them, he was just Derek, the quiet guy who showed up every Wednesday to help out. Between his therapy sessions and volunteering, Derek had discovered something he'd never expected: the joy of simply being useful without any authority or power. Last weekend, he'd helped sort donations at the food bank, and tomorrow he was scheduled to help clean up the community garden. As he dried his hands and prepared to take out the trash, Derek caught sight of an elderly woman struggling with her walker near the entrance. Without hesitation, he moved to hold the door open for her. She thanked him with a warm smile, and he felt that familiar flutter in his chest. Not pride, but something gentler, more genuine. "You know, we could use someone strong like you for our Saturday morning deliveries," Maria mentioned as Derek returned. "Some of our elderly residents can't make it to the center." Derek nodded, already reaching for the sign-up sheet. "Put me down for that," he said quietly. "But maybe somewhere in the background? I'm better at lifting boxes than talking to people." Maria gave him a knowing look but didn't push. She'd noticed how he always chose tasks that kept him out of the spotlight, but she'd also seen how dependable he'd become. Every shift, every task, completed without complaint or need for recognition. As Derek finished his shift and walked home in the gathering dusk, he felt a subtle shift in his heart. Each small act of service, each moment of helping others without expecting anything in return, was slowly rebuilding something inside him. Not his reputation, he wasn't interested in that anymore, but his humanity, piece by quiet piece. Derek stood on his mother's porch, a warm apple pie from the local bakery in his hands. This time there was no hesitation when he rang the doorbell. His mother's face lit up when she opened the door, a sight that still amazed him after all these months of reconciliation. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said, but her smile told him she was pleased. "I wanted to," Derek replied, following her into the familiar kitchen where they'd shared so many conversations lately. As his mother cut generous slices of pie, Derek noticed the new photos she'd put up on the refrigerator, recent ones of them together at the park, at her birthday dinner, and even one from the community garden where he volunteered. Each image captured a moment of healing between them. They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window and warming their faces. His mother told him about her book club, and Derek found himself genuinely laughing at her animated description of their latest dramatic discussion. "You seem different today," his mother observed, studying his face. "More at peace." Derek nodded, taking a thoughtful bite of pie. "I think I am," he said softly. "You know, Bradley, Commissioner Fisher, he told me something that really stuck with me. He said redemption isn't something you achieve and check off a list. It's a journey that never really ends." His mother reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You've come so far, Derek. I see it every day." Looking at their joined hands, Derek felt the truth of both statements, how far he'd come and how far he still had to go. The anger that once consumed him had mellowed into something quieter, more contemplative. He'd learned to listen more than speak, to help more than judge, to understand more than assume. "I'm not that same angry man anymore, Mom," he said, meeting her eyes, "and I'm sorry it took me so long to figure that out." "What matters is that you did," she replied, her eyes glistening with tears. As they sat there sharing pie and memories, Derek felt a deep sense of gratitude. Grace, accountability, and self-forgiveness. These weren't just words anymore. They were the stepping stones on his continuing journey, each one teaching him something new about himself and the person he was becoming. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Derek and Bradley, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.